Thank you for coming out tonight. I know there's a Cubs game on TV, and that's probably kept a few people home. And thank you for that lovely introduction. You know, whenever Muhammad Ali would get introduced in front of a crowd, or even, you know, at the White House, he would always make the same joke. He would say, "Thank you for that lovely introduction. You're not as dumb as you look." You can do that when you're Muhammad Ali. It helps to be, you know, 6'4" and gorgeous and the heavyweight champion of the world. I'm not any of those things. You might have noticed, but it's not really important for a biographer to have anything in common with his subject. That's a good thing for me. I do have one thing in common with Ali. I have an amazingly fast jab. Do you want to see my jab?
Yeah.
Do you want to see it again?
Yeah.
That's another Ali joke. The important thing for a biographer is not to have anything in common with his subject, it's to try to understand his subject, is to have empathy, which is really the reason we read, is to try to get inside someone else's head, right? Even when we read fiction, is to take us to worlds that we can't imagine, maybe to worlds that don't exist if you're reading science fiction, or to take us back in time if you're reading history or historical fiction. So I think for the biographer, you need to have curiosity, you need to have diligence, you need to have discipline, you have to dig through years and years of papers, you have to do hundreds and hundreds of interviews. For this Ali book, I did at least 600 interviews. I lost count after a while because sometimes I'd be on the phone with somebody every day for weeks. And I can tell you that I interviewed at least 250 people, but I can't really tell you how many times I interviewed them. I counted every punch that Ali threw over the course of his career and every punch that he was hit with. And I worked with speech scientists to look at his voice, to see how those punches were affecting his ability to speak, and concluded that over the course of his 20s, from the age of 20 to 30, from the age of 30 to 40 basically, he lost 26% of his speaking ability. And you could correlate it with the fights, so that when he's getting hit more, he's losing more speaking ability. So I did about 3.5 years of research on this book. I've interviewed, like I said, hundreds of people. And it's all in an attempt to understand this man. Not to play God and to tell you that I know what he thought, but to try to understand how Ali became Ali. And one of the people I interviewed for the book, I know we're trying to get the PowerPoint, but I still, was Dick Gregory, the legendary comedian and activist, and a guy who did not mince his words. He said to me, "Listen, white boy, if you were going to write a book about Muhammad Ali, you better be able to do one thing. You better be able to tell me how a black kid growing up in the Jim Crow South," and Ali and Dick Gregory were the same age. They were both, I think, 11 or 12 when Emmett Till was murdered. That you better be able to explain to me what made a black kid growing up in the Jim Crow South think he could be special. Because we were told every step of the way that we were less than equal. For somebody to grow up thinking he could go around calling himself the greatest, how did he do it? What made him think he could get away with that? Because that's what got Emmett Till killed. So I kind of felt like I had my marching orders there. Oh, we got a picture of Ali up there, great. So where do you begin in attempting to write a life story of somebody you'd never met? Well, obviously you try to meet him, but Ali at that point hadn't given an interview in more than a decade, so I had very little hope of getting an interview. I certainly hoped to meet him. But you begin by reading everything you can about your subject, and you begin by trying to interview the people who were closest to him. And in this case, unlike when I wrote about Al Capone or Jackie Robinson, there were hundreds, thousands of people around who knew Muhammad Ali, who knew him well. His brother was still alive, his 3 out of his 4 wives, many of the men he fought. So where do you begin? I began with this woman, Khalila Ali, his second wife. And it just so happened, when I had this idea for a book, she was in Chicago a few weeks later after this. I just decided I was going to write Muhammad Ali's biography. Why me, right? I have no right to do this, but I just decided I was going to try. And she was in Chicago for a film that was premiering, and I went to the film and got there early and tried to meet her, and I said, "Mrs. Ali, my name is Jonathan Eig, and I want to write a book about your husband." And she said, "Well, who gave you permission?" And I said, nobody, but I really want to do a good job. I really want to do this right. And of course, I tried to flatter her, and I said, you're such an important part of the story. You know, you were married to him for probably the most important years of his life, from 1967 to 77, when he was out of boxing because he was banned from the sport, all the way until he came back, won the heavyweight championship again, and went from being the most hated man in America to being one of the most beloved. I've got to have your story in there. She said, well, it's going to cost you $6,000 for an interview. I did not pay for the interview, but I kept after her. I'm very persistent, and I don't want to say charming. There's a fine line between charming and stalking, and I was somewhere in the middle. I found a photographer for the Nation of Islam who lived in the south side of Chicago who had thousands of pictures of Ali. His full-time job for 20 years was just to follow Ali around and take pictures for the Muhammad Speaks newspaper. And he had wedding photos from Ali and Khalila's wedding. So I bought some of those pictures and sent them to Khalila, and I said, there's more where that came from. All you have to do is let me come visit you for an interview. And Khalila and I hit it off. We became friends, and she started talking, and she decided she was going to trust me with her story. This is over the course of, more than a year and a half of charming/stalking. From there, I went to this man. That's Muhammad Ali's brother, Rudy Clay. They were born, as you probably know, Muhammad Ali was born Cassius Marcellus Clay Jr. This is his brother, Rudolph Valentino Clay, who now goes by the name of Rahman Ali. And when I called Rudy and asked him, Rahman, if he would give me an interview, he only wanted $1,000. So the prices were coming down. But I wouldn't pay. I started calling him. I would just call him all the time and say, Rahman, I just have one question. He said, $1,000. Just one question. What was your dog's name? $1,000. I said, that's a terrible name for a dog. He said, that's not funny, and it's still $1,000. But eventually I got Rahman to talk to me. I didn't pay him. And I did call him one time. I was in Louisville. I said, I'll take you to any restaurant you want in Louisville. My treat, you and your wife. Anywhere you want to go. Pick the fanciest place in town. We get in the car. We drove for like 45 minutes. Where the hell are we going? Like, I thought we were driving like into Tennessee or something. We finally pull up at this place where you see us right there. It's a $8.99 all-you-can-eat Chinese buffet. And he said, don't worry, it's only $6.99 for seniors. It was pretty good. But Rahman told me about their childhood. This is where they grew up. This is an 800-square-foot house in the West End neighborhood of Louisville. And Cassius Clay Jr. was the son of a sign painter. His father was a sign painter. His mother was a housekeeper. Like most black women in the 1940s and 50s, she had to make a living working for white women and white families, cooking for families other than her own, and bringing home leftovers, buying books for her kids, buying books for her church with the small payment that she received for taking care of someone else's family. They were not poor. Most boxers come out of poverty. Ali did not. He was teased by it, actually, by the other boxers. They thought of him as bourgeois because he had two parents and he came from a decent home and he always had food to eat and had a dog, as I mentioned earlier. His dog's name was Rusty. I got that without paying $1,000 for that information. And Ali used to stand, I wonder if this has a little pointer on it. Oh, yeah. Ali used to stand right there between these two houses and have his brother Rudy throw rocks at him to see if he could dodge the rocks. That was one of the things they did for fun. And young Cassius Clay was so fast that he thought his brother, no matter how hard he threw, would never be able to hit him with a rock. And that was one of the skills that would serve him well as a boxer. He was incredibly fast and able to duck punches. How many people know the story of Ali's stolen bicycle? When he was 12 years old, sometimes when you hear these stories about how someone, George Washington chopping down the cherry tree, these things turn out to be myths. This one's true. Cassius Clay and his brother were riding one bike. They shared a bike. In 1954, and it started to rain. They ducked into this building to get out from the rain. When they came back, the bicycle was stolen.
was gone. They went looking for a police officer to report the theft. They had a really nice bicycle, and they were worried their father was going to beat them. Their father was abusive and a heavy drinker. So they went looking for a police officer. Somebody says, there's a police officer in the basement of the building you were just in. This is the Columbia Auditorium. They go running down to the basement. They find a white police officer named Joe Martin, and he's running a boxing clinic. Ali goes up to this white police officer and says, someone stole my bike. I'm going to beat him up if I can find him, but I need help. And the police officer says, well, before you go beating anybody up, do you know how to fight? And young Cassius says, no, but I'm tough. The cop says, well, I can't really help you with your bike, but if you want to learn how to box, come back. And this is a magical moment for Ali, not just because he discovers boxing, but he discovers some other things. He discovers a white police officer who actually wants to help him. His father and most African-American parents at the time had told him, white police officers do not have happy interactions. Nothing good comes from an interaction with a white cop in the South. Stay away from white cops. And Ali's father had been arrested several times for drunken bar fights and things like that. So here's a white police officer who seems interested in this kid. And he looks around and he sees in the boxing ring black kids punching white kids. He's never seen that before. That's another thing that's supposed to get you in trouble. So he begins to realize that maybe there are some different rules in the boxing ring than there are in the rest of the universe. And his father's been warning him for years that black people are never going to get a fair shake in this country. His father's a Garveyite and believes that the only way forward is for black people to leave the United States and go back to Africa. But suddenly, his father never told him about this, so maybe there are ways to beat his dad. Maybe there are ways to win at this thing, and the rules don't have to necessarily apply. He becomes the hardest worker in Joe Martin's gym. He's only 12 years old when he meets Joe Martin. He weighs 85 pounds. There's no way to predict that this kid's going to be great. But he's excited about something. He's also dyslexic. He doesn't do well in school. He's desperate for attention. He loves being the center of the show. Boxing gives him a chance to get attention, to be good at something. He hasn't been good at anything except playing the class clown until now. He goes on in 1960 at the age of almost 18 to win the light heavyweight gold medal in Rome Olympics. And when he comes back, he discovers that he is a star. He loves being a star. He wears this medal everywhere. Everywhere he goes, he says, "Do you know who I am? I'm the heavyweight champion. I'm the Olympic gold medalist." He gets fake newspapers printed up. Ali beats Patterson, wins heavyweight championship. He's just a few years premature, but the confidence is already there. And everybody notices that this kid has star power. And he likes getting under people's skin. He likes getting on people's nerves. He goes to see Gorgeous George. Everybody know who Gorgeous George is? The professional wrestler who used to spray himself with perfume and wear his hair in curlers and pretend to be a woman or homosexual, whatever he was putting on. He wanted the crowd to hate him. And Ali saw that and said, ooh, that's good. If it works for a white man, imagine how well it'll work for a black man. And he starts intentionally trying to anger people, being a bad sport, heckling his opponents. And he thinks if he does this, he'll get a shot at the heavyweight championship sooner than if he just follows the rules. So here again, this idea that you can do things that your father says you're not supposed to. Athletes are supposed to be sportsmanlike. Black athletes in particular are supposed to be well-behaved, right? You appreciate what the white man is giving you, this opportunity to box and be a champion. When Joe Louis was the heavyweight champion, he wasn't allowed to raise his arms in the air after knocking out a white opponent, because some people might think that was suggesting that black people were superior, that he was superior to the man he just knocked out. Imagine that you're not allowed to show your superiority to a man you just beat into a bloody pulp and defeated. But no, Joe Louis had to play by the white man's rules. Ali's saying, I'm not playing by those rules. And as a result of his antics, he gets a shot at the heavyweight championship in 1964, chance to fight Sonny Liston, who's considered the baddest heavyweight of all time in many people's opinions. The last three opponents were knocked out in a combined 2 minutes. I mean, he just destroys everyone he meets. So the consensus view is that this young Cassius Clay has no chance. And I should mention that he never really learned to box properly. We think of him as the greatest heavyweight of all time, but he never learned some of the simple things like putting your hands up to protect your head when you fight, or ducking punches, He was so quick that he didn't have to. He could just move his head at the last minute and get away with it. And it worked for a while, but everybody said, once you fight Sonny Liston, forget it. It might have worked when you were fighting these tomato cans, but it's not going to work against one of the greatest heavyweights of all time. When they were getting ready for the fight and they surveyed the reporters, every reporter predicted Ali was going to lose. The only real debate seemed to be whether he was going to get knocked out in the first round or killed in the first round. And I talked to a reporter who told me his editor assigned him to drive the route to the hospital, all the different possible routes to determine which is the fastest, so that he could be there to see if Ali was still alive when the ambulance took him to the hospital. But Ali defeats Sonny Liston, humiliates him really, and becomes the heavyweight champion. And it's really at this moment in 1964 that everything changes for him, because not only does he become the heavyweight champion, and in the 1960s, being heavyweight champion was the closest thing to being Superman. You were like a god on earth. You were the baddest man on the planet. And boxing was far more popular than any other sport, and it was popular worldwide. So imagine, being the Super Bowl MVP times 100. And that's what you might begin to imagine what it was like to be the heavyweight champ. It's a chance also to cash in. Endorsement deals start coming in, Coca-Cola, everything. But Ali has a secret. After he wins this fight, he announces that he's joining the Nation of Islam, and he's converting from Christianity. Christianity was a slave religion, he says. It was forced on his people. He didn't choose it. And this name, Cassius Clay, that's a slave name. It's from a white guy who owned his people and stuck this name on him like a cattle brand. I don't have to have this name that you people gave me. I don't have to have your religion anymore. I'm a follower of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. The Nation of Islam says that black people are superior to white people, and that all of you whiteys are going to die, and we're going to control the earth someday. Furthermore, he says, just because I'm black doesn't mean I have to do what you think you want me to do. I'm free to be who I am. I'm free to say what I want. I'm free to do what I want. You can't control me. And he says this as the heavyweight champion of the world. Guy who has microphone in his hand and live TV after every fight. He can say what he wants and nobody can stop him. And if you think Colin Kaepernick is unpopular today, man, you should see what Ali got for this. Soon after that, he announced that he was, this is Elijah Muhammad in the middle there, and Rudy on the left. Rudy's in almost every photo ever taken of Muhammad Ali. There he is again in the plaid jacket. But after this, Ali announces that he won't fight in Vietnam because it's against his religion. He's sentenced to 5 years in prison. He's convicted of draft evasion. Boxing officials strip him of his heavyweight championship, strip him of his license, so he's not allowed to fight anymore. Government takes his passport, so he can't fight outside the U.S. even if he wants to try. And while he appeals this case, he's free. He remains free while the case is on appeal, but he can't make a living. For 3.5 years, in what should have been the prime of his career, he can't box. He goes around and speaks on college campuses, makes a little bit of money that way, but it's important to remember that Ali, during those 3.5 years, didn't know that he was ever going to get back. He was prepared to give up his heavyweight championship, give up his career forever. He was prepared to go to jail and never box again because he believed that the Nation of Islam forbid him to fight in Vietnam. Now, after 3.5 years, his case made its way through the courts. The Supreme Court reversed his conviction. He was allowed to box again. And in 1971, he comes back against Joe Frazier. Many people call this the fight of the century. I think it's Ali's greatest fight. And I think it's a big turning point in his career to understand how Ali goes from being the most hated man in America. And you should see some of the hate mail that he received. I've read it. It's vile. But he goes from being the most hated man in America in the late 1960s to less than a decade later being a national hero. How? I think it starts right here in this moment that you can see on the screen. In the 15th round, after a brutal fight, Ali's not the same when he comes back. He's not as fast. He's getting hit. He's taking punches. He's taking brutal punches all night long from Joe Frazier. And finally, in the beginning of the 15th round, Frazier lets go with this giant left hook. Ali goes down. You can see already, look at his jaw, that his jaw is broken. And what happens next is as soon as he goes down, he pops back up. He said later that he was unconscious on the way down, and when his butt hit the mat, it woke him up. But when he gets up, I think that's the moment that transforms Ali's image in the American eye, because here's a guy who fought the U.S. government, would not compromise, robbed of 3.5 years of his career, robbed of millions of dollars, comes back and fights Joe Frazier, loses this fight, but gets back up and keeps fighting. And I think it's in that moment that Americans begin to say, he was still a draft-dodging coward. Some people say that. But you got to respect his toughness. He took his punishment from the government. He took his punishment from Joe Frazier, and he got back up. And that's the kind of grit that every American can admire, even if you hated him for his politics. So from here, he's got to earn his way back toward another shot at the heavyweight championship. He's got to fight for another 3 years before he gets a chance to take the title that the government took away from him. And in 1974, he gets a chance against George Foreman in Africa, in Zaire, of all places. The rumble in the jungle, as Don King called it. Crazy idea to have this fight in the middle of Africa, in the middle of a dictatorship, in a country where Americans cannot possibly reach to go watch this fight. But it becomes kind of a referendum on who is the baddest black man on earth. It becomes kind of a statement about black power and black pride. This country where we came from, where we once were kings, were sent to America as slaves. We come back now as warriors, as free men, as people who can earn $5 million in one night for boxing. And whoever wins this fight, Ali or Foreman, is the king of Africa, the king of America, the king of the world. The only problem is that Ali seems to have no chance in this fight. George Foreman is like Sonny Liston. He's considered unbeatable. Frazier beat Ali. Well, Foreman just destroyed, annihilated Frazier, knocked him down 6 times. Ali is now 32 years old, past his prime. Foreman is younger, stronger. Everybody assumes Ali has no chance. I have to pause to tell you a funny story about George Foreman before I go on, and I think you know what happens in the fight. But Ali loved to humiliate his opponents. And he called Joe Frazier an Uncle Tom, which made no sense because Joe Frazier was a proud black man who actually came from far more poverty than Ali did and really earned it. But Ali wasn't going to show him any respect. I called him Uncle Tom. So he's on the plane over to Zaire, and he says to his manager, "Are they going to know what I'm talking about if I call George Foreman an Uncle Tom?" And his manager says, "No, I don't think so. I don't think the people in Zaire are going to know what Uncle Tom is." So Ali says, "Well, who do they hate?" And his manager says, "Well, they hate the Belgians. The Belgians pretty much raped and pillaged this country, robbed it of all its wealth, chopped off people's heads and stuck them on flagpoles, Heart of Darkness, that thing." I said, okay, I heard enough. He gets off the plane. There's thousands of people on the tarmac waiting to greet him. He says, "I am the greatest. George Foreman is a Belgian." Foreman shows up the next day and can't understand why everybody hates him. But Foreman also said to me that his manager drugged him before. George Foreman believes that his own manager drugged him before this fight. And he says, "I'll tell you something else. Before the fight, my manager told me we needed to give the referee $10,000 in cash to make sure it was a fair fight. And I found out later that Ali gave the ref $20,000 in cash. No, wait, did I say $25,000? Yeah, Foreman said that they gave the ref $25,000 cash, and he said that Ali gave the ref $50,000 cash. I got my numbers mixed up. So I called Ali's manager, Gene Kilroy, and I said, Gene, Foreman says that he gave the ref $25,000 before the fight, and that you guys gave him $50,000 before the fight. And Kilroy says, that's ridiculous. That's the stupidest thing I ever heard. We only gave him $10,000. But that's boxing. Regardless, Foreman starts to tire. Maybe he was drugged. I don't know. Ali knocks him out. He becomes the heavyweight champion again, wins back the title that the government took away. And I wish my book had ended there. I wish that he had retired after that fight. In fact, Elijah Muhammad and Ali had always obeyed Elijah Muhammad. Ali believed that Elijah Muhammad was a prophet of God. And Elijah Muhammad called and said, you have to retire. You've done everything you can possibly do. You're getting up there in years. Retire as the champion while you still have your health. Come and work with me and walk away. And Ali couldn't do it. This is 1974. He continued to fight for another 7 years and fought more and more often. What happened was he began to realize that he lacked the discipline to stay in shape, so the only way that he could really push himself to stay in shape was to schedule more fights. So he would fight sometimes once a month. And he took terrible beatings in some of these fights, and he began to sort of sell himself out to commercials like this one. He was a terrible businessman. He would sign anything, any contract you put in front of him. So people would come to him and say, we want to do Muhammad Ali vitamins. Okay, great. We want to do Champ Cola. Okay, great. One of his business managers told me that he signed away, and it was always cash. For $5,000 cash, he signed a contract for Champ Cola without realizing that the contract said that he could never endorse another soft drink. So for the rest of his life, he couldn't do Coke or Pepsi because he'd taken $5,000 cash. He just wanted to please people. It goes back throughout his life, you see it. He had this immense desire to please people. I think that's why he was married so many times and why he had so many mistresses and why he ran through his money. Anybody wanted to come work for him. He had a job for them. There was always more room in the entourage. It came from a really good place in his heart, I think, that he just wanted to make people around him happy. Maybe it came from being an abused child, growing up in a home of an alcoholic. I'm not a psychiatrist, but you can see that Ali just desperately wanted to please. In fact, one of the things that drove me crazy was that he never really seemed to stick to his ideals. He went on later in life to endorse Republicans. He endorsed Ronald Reagan. Jesse Jackson was running for president. Jesse Jackson had been Ali's friend for decades, and Ali said, sorry, the Republicans got to me first. He just. Somebody asked him once if he had any regrets in his life, and he said, I really regret that thing I said about Vietnam. And I thought, what are you talking about? That's the most important thing you ever said. That's the reason that you're going to be in the history books, because you took a stand. And he said, I don't regret that I refused to fight, but I regret that I made so many people mad. And that just tells you so much about him, that he wanted to be the rebel. He wanted to antagonize. He wanted to stand up to power. He wanted to fight, especially notions of white supremacy. But he also wanted to please. And he couldn't stand the thought that people were mad at him. And those warring impulses were never calmed within him. So he actually, I should have saved that for a second for dramatic purposes. Pretend you didn't see that. After he retired, so he lost his last two fights. Was brutally beaten by Larry Holmes and then Trevor Berbick. And then in the 80s, he kind of disappeared. You could hire Ali to come to your trade show, to sit at your used car lot for an afternoon for $2,000, $3,000. And he would stay all day. He loved people. He would sit there signing autographs until every last person had their autograph signed. I can tell you story after story of Ali doing kind things like that. Just, if you saw him in an airport and you said, oh my God, my wife's not going to believe that I met you, Muhammad, he would say, well, let's go to your house. Let's go knock on your wife's door. Wouldn't she be amazed by that? And he would do it. And then he'd stay for dinner. He He loved people, but he was depressed into the 80s and even into the 90s because his speech had slowed down from Parkinson's. He didn't look good on TV. He wasn't being asked to come on Johnny Carson anymore. He couldn't do commercials because his voice was almost impossible to understand. And then this happened in 1996. And I don't know how many people remember that night watching that on TV in Atlanta. It was a big secret. Nobody knew who was going to light the torch. And Joan Benoit Samuelson took the torch up to the top of the stadium, and the announcers were still not sure who it was going to be. A lot of people thought maybe it was going to be Hank Aaron. And then you see Ali in this white tracksuit begin to emerge from the shadows. And go back tonight and listen to it, watch it on YouTube. The crowd doesn't cheer. They don't roar, they gasp. They're so stunned because it's almost like a ghost. They hadn't seen him in so long, and they certainly hadn't seen him looking like this, his hands shaking, the flame fluttering, and he can't light the torch. His hand is shaking too much, and the wind is blowing, and it looks like the flame is going to set his arm on fire. And people are scared. They're afraid that, first of all, he's going to be humiliated, and second of all, he might be hurt. And then he gets the torch lit, and a little smile comes on his face, and the crowd begins to chant, Ali, Ali, Ali. And it's in that moment that Ali is rediscovered and embraced in a way he'd never been embraced before. And he even said the next day in an interview with a newspaper reporter, he said, people are going to love me even more now because now they see I'm human. I'm sick. I get old. I get weak just like everybody else. Now everybody can relate to me. And he really believed that. He really thought, and he was right in a way, because we respected him for his political views. We certainly respected him for his fighting. And we loved him, but we also hated him. But now, everybody could relate to him. And he was willing to show us his weakness. He was willing to let the world see him with his hands shaking. And that's a different kind of courage. And I think that's the moment when he really became this transcendent figure. So I want to just tell you a little bit more about my journey. I mentioned in the beginning that one of the first things I did was to try to meet Ali. And I interviewed his wives, I interviewed his children, and his current wife, Lonnie, his widow now, wouldn't participate in the book. She's the only one who I did not get an interview with because she is only allowed to work on projects that are officially licensed by Muhammad Ali Enterprises. But she did meet with me a few times, and she gave me some advice. She coached me on how to get other people to talk to me, and she told her friends that it was okay to talk to me. And one day I said, Lonnie, I'd really just like to come meet Muhammad. I'd met Lonnie several times, but I hadn't met Muhammad. I'd gone to several events where he was supposed to show up, and he'd been too sick. He was getting older and more frequently hospitalized. And one day I was writing Lonnie a letter. I would often send her copies of things that I found in my research. I found like the wedding certificate for Ali's parents, and I would send her a copy of it. One day I was writing a letter to Ali, and my little girl, who was 5 at the time, came into my office and said, "What are you doing?" I said, "I'm writing a letter to Muhammad Ali and to Lonnie Ali." And she said, "Oh, can I write a letter to Muhammad?" Because she heard me talking about Muhammad Ali all the time, and she didn't know who it was. She didn't really believe that there was such a thing as boxing, because people would never hit each other like that. But she took a piece of paper and she asked me how to spell Muhammad, and she wrote, "Dear Muhammad, my daddy really loves you. Do you love my daddy?" I said, "Ooh, that's really good." I stuck it in the envelope, and Lonnie called me like 3 days later and said, "Why don't you bring Lola and come for a visit?" So Lola and I flew to Phoenix, went to the house, and Muhammad was too sick. He stayed in his room. We were there for 2 hours with Lonnie, and Muhammad never came out. About 3 or 4 months later, Lonnie called me and said, "He's feeling much better, and we're going to be in Louisville. Why don't you come?" So I drove down to Louisville that next day, and all day long I'm thinking, what am I going to say to this guy if I meet him? I have to try to ask him a question. I don't know if he can answer, but I have to try to. I was going crazy thinking, what am I going to say? What am I going to ask him? And I got down to Louisville, I had a few hours to kill. I went for a run. I like to jog, and I ran along the route that Ali used to run when he was training as a teenager to be a boxer. And as I'm running, I'm thinking, this is stupid. Like, you really think that you're going to learn, kind of like what Dick Gregory said to me, white boy, you really think you're going to understand what it was like to be a black kid in the Jim Crow South running through these same streets? I mean, don't be an idiot. But it was while I was running that I realized what I was gonna say to Ali. That night, Lonnie introduced me to him, and he didn't look up. I couldn't really tell if he knew I was there, but I put my hand on his arm and I whispered in his ear and I said, "Mr. Ali, my name is Jonathan Eig, and I'm writing your biography. And I know you didn't ask me to, and nobody gave me permission, but I just want you to know I'm going to do my best to tell the story right, and I'm working really hard on it. And I just want to know if there's anything you want to say. You know, the last word should be yours. It's your story." And he didn't answer. And I don't even know if he heard me. But in a way, I think it's okay, because Ali never made it easy on anybody. He certainly didn't make it easy on his opponents. He didn't make it easy on his wives. He wasn't going to make it easy on me and give me an easy answer. It was my book. I have to come up with the ending, and it's his life. And this is not the last book that's ever going to be written on Ali, but I hope it's the best. And I think what I took away from this experience, and what I took away from Dick Gregory's message to me, you know, what made Ali think he could be special? He didn't accept the world as he found it. He didn't accept the rules that others imposed on him. White people said he couldn't do this, he couldn't do that. He didn't care. He was going to try. He was going to try to do things differently. And no matter how often he got knocked down, he got back up. And I think when you do that, when you can say that, that's what makes you the greatest of all time. So thank you very much. And I'm happy to take some questions. Yes?
What was his relationship in the later years with the Nation of Islam?
Oh, really good question. So Elijah Muhammad died in the late 70s, and one of Elijah's sons took over the Nation of Islam and began to move it toward Orthodox Islam. The Nation of Islam was always this sort of strange hybrid. It was a black pride group, black power group that used some of the points of traditional Orthodox Islam, but wasn't really about traditional Islam. So Ali began, when the Nation of Islam began to move toward Orthodox Islam, Ali began to study Orthodox Islam, and he became a fairly devout Sunni Muslim in later years. And when Louis Farrakhan later rebuilt the Nation of Islam, he went back to Ali and asked Ali to join, and Ali said no. He was done with that. Yeah, if we won the war, then he looked good, because he came out against the war when the war was still pretty popular. And then as the anti-war movement spread across college campuses and it became part of the civil rights movement, and Martin Luther King spoke out against the war, then Ali had more support. And by the time he comes back from boxing, America's changed. We now agree with him that he was probably right about Vietnam.
He kind of like Joe Louis in World War II, saying, "I got no
Right.
grudge against the Nazis."
Yeah, but Vietnam was a different kind of a war, because we weren't under attack. But yes, it would have been different. For that matter, if the segregationists had won, Ali would also, be on the wrong side. But part of being brave means, and standing up for what you believe in, means accepting the fact that you might end up being wrong and come out on the wrong side of history. Could have been really unpopular. When he said all these radical things, he said them with a smile, and he was still joking around and making his rhymes. So even when he was at his most radical, when he was at his most obnoxious, when he was calling white people the blue-eyed devils, he would still go on Johnny Carson and joke around with Johnny Carson. So how do you make sense of a guy like that? He was impossible to pin down. And he didn't care. He didn't really have a firm political ideology. He was making it up as he went along. And he wanted people to laugh along with him. So it made it harder to hate him over time, especially in the 70s, as he started talking politics a little bit less and entertained us a little bit more and palled around with Howard Cosell, all of that. He became an entertainer, too.
I was going to say, this guy's crazy.
Yes.
That's
Yeah, Ali was a great player of mind games. So he would try to make people think he was crazy. He would try to make them think that he didn't care, if he got beat. He was just going to...
Deserting to your opponent, I mean, you're fighting this guy, and he comes across as a crazy guy.
Right.
You know.
Well, you know, they say in the in the prison yard, the most dangerous guy in the prison yard is not the biggest one; it's the craziest one.
Yeah.
And that's what. And I think, and Sonny Liston had been in prison, so he may have Ali may have been playing right to his weak spot.
In your research, did you hear anything speculation at all about Liston throwing his fight?
Oh, some people think that both Liston fights were thrown. I think the second one, Liston, right? I think Liston probably threw that one. In my opinion, I can't prove it. The first one, I think he just got whooped, and he didn't want to be humiliated, and so he didn't come back out to fight the seventh round. But I don't think we'll ever really know if they were fixed. Yes. No, I don't think it made much difference. Boxing has become much less popular, but it's not because of the head injuries. Ironically, it's because the business side of the sport has fallen apart, and it's been so badly managed that it's no longer lucrative, really, for American kids to go into boxing. They can do better off. They're better off with football or basketball. There's just more money to be made, and boxing has just fallen on hard times. But it has nothing to do with the head injuries. Unfortunately, I wish that the head injuries got more attention. Well, his medical condition was caused by the punches. He did not have Parkinson's disease. He had Parkinson's syndrome, which replicates a lot of the symptoms of Parkinson's disease. But his doctors, when they diagnosed it, said it was almost certainly caused by the punches. Yeah, Layla's one of the few people who decided not to talk to me, but I did talk to her mom. And I think Layla wanted to impress her dad and get her dad's attention. He wasn't around when they were growing up. And Layla talked about, in her own book, about how sad it was not to have her dad there and to see other families sitting down to dinner together. So I think going into boxing was a way to get him to come around and pay some attention to her. And she was good at it, too. That always helped.
He talked about him wanting to be liked and not signing the contract. So.
He was pretty much broke by the time he retired from boxing. But his wife, Lonnie, after his retirement and after the Olympic torch, made some excellent business decisions, and he died very wealthy. So Lonnie really is the hero of that story. She got rid of the bloodsuckers and made some really smart moves to secure the family's finances. They were married for 30 years, I think. So he was married 4 times. The first woman he was only married to for a couple of years because the Nation of Islam forced them to divorce because she didn't want to become a Muslim. And then he married Khalila 10 years, Veronica Porsche for 10 years, and then Lonnie. Oh, sure. So I'm working on a documentary on Ali with Ken Burns that will probably be out in 2021. And we're now in the process of doing interviews. And we're trying to make an 8-part Ali miniseries for CBS. We've got the first 2 scripts done, and we're waiting to see if the network is going to tell us to write the next 6. If they could also just pull the plug at any moment. So I don't know. I'm trying to be cautiously optimistic. And I'm also working, as you said earlier, on a Martin Luther King biography that's going to take me probably 40 or 50 years to get done, but I'm having fun. I'm getting to work on some exciting things.
So how do you find
The connections just come from hard work, making a lot of phone calls, getting rejected a lot. Like I said, the first few times Mrs. Ali didn't want to talk to me and Rockwan didn't want to talk to me. You just keep pushing and pushing. You get somebody to go on to bat on your behalf. If you're trying to get an interview with Louis Farrakhan or with Jesse Jackson, you think about who have I interviewed so far, who can maybe speak to them on my behalf. And that's why it takes 3 or 4 years to write one of these books, because getting through to those people takes a long time, and then convincing them to talk to me, and it's not easy. And I think in the long run, it's about building trust. It's about showing them that I mean well, that I'm trying to do this right, that my books are honest, that I don't have an axe to grind, I don't take any sides, I'm not trying to, for example, with Ali's wives, I'm not taking any wife's side. I want you all to be in the book. And also, if you don't talk, she's talking, and she's going to talk about you. So you do whatever you can, but ultimately it's about trying to build trust. No, that was Frazier. That was the third Frazier fight.
That's third.
Yeah, and I think that fight is one of the saddest because they both just are never the same after that. They both take such a terrible beating.
What year?
That was 76. Just a brutal fight.
He won the second and third fight.
Right, he won the second and third. But each one he's just, diminished. And he said that third fight was the closest thing to death he'd ever experienced, and he was never the same after that. Now, it came out after Dick Gregory died, but I don't know if he read it. I never got his review. No. So we have some books in the back. I'm happy to sign them if anybody wants one. And thank you for coming tonight. And
Go Cubs.
go Cubs. Anybody know the scores? Anybody checked yet?